So I was gonna watch this RFK interview by Brian Tyler Cohen. I haven't seen long form content where RFK is put under pressure, and all of the content that he is put under pressure is short form, and all of the long form content is just too simpy. It's simping him, it's bringing him on there just to give long diatribes. So to have somebody who's Joe Biden's strongest warrior, you know, a real libtard, as I try to grasp for a better word, I just fall on libtard, having him being the one to interview RFK about the potentiality of him acting as a spoiler, about his actual odds of becoming president, about his previous statements on vaccines and other matters. I think it's good. Long form pressure. I don't like the mainstream stuff because it's too short form and you can't get any good in-depth analysis. Don't like a lot of the alternative long form stuff because sometimes it's just endless rambling or just simpage to the interview subject. And so this should give us an interesting result. And so I wanted to watch this. Let's check it out.
Now we've got Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's running for president of the United States as an independent candidate. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Brian, thanks for having me.
Now, obviously, running as an independent, getting on the ballot is the whole ballgame here. So where do you stand right now with regard to ballot access?
I think we're on the ballot in 7 states. We have the signatures for another 8 states in the can, which means we have more than enough. Usually we try to get double what we're required to give us, because the DNC is going to come in the end and try to invalidate our signatures. So we want to make sure that we have a good cushion for that, for insurance. We're not handing those in for strategic reasons until the last minute to narrow the window that the DNC has to kind of tear the whole thing apart. So most of them, or many of them, you don't have to hand in until the end of July. And then the DNC will have about a week to go through them, whereas if we hand them in now, they'll have 4 months to go through them, or 5 months.
Well, let's talk about the presidential run more broadly. Nationally, you are, based on an aggregate of polling, according to Decision Desk HQ, you're at about 8.5% right now, down from 19% in September. In Texas, it looks like just below 10% right now, down from 12%. In Florida, you're at about 7.5%, down from 11%. Nevada, you're at 9%, down from 11%. And in Michigan, you're at...
Immediately, he gets bad polling numbers, and he turns to his staff. We're off to a good start.
At about 8%, down from 26%. So what's the path to victory here?
Well, excuse me, Brian, but have you considered the polling numbers where I'm not losing, which are none of them, but in some of them, I have 4 more numbers.
Yeah, we don't believe those polling results. And there's actually a very good article in The Hill today that talks about how the polling companies, the polling establishments have changed their methodologies to ask questions in a way that makes it, that dampens our poll results. We're on, the DN, or this, one of the controversies that's happening right now, Brian, is that CNN is negotiating with the Trump and Biden staff, their campaigns, to try to exclude me from the debates. And they've come up with criteria that I need to be among the 2 criteria.
Can I just throw out there? In principle, I'm not against the idea, depending on a real surge change in American politics, where a third-party candidate could actually get on the stage and debate with 2 of the main parties. I wouldn't necessarily be against that. If anything, it would be an acknowledgement in some way that the 2 main parties had failed to such a catastrophic way that a system almost made and crafted to serve 2-party political systems is somehow still making space for a third party, or that there's enough political will to bring about a political environment where third parties could be viable. RFK would be the worst possible option if that was your goal. Because RFK is going to get up there, say a bunch of stupid things, get dogged on by both Trump and Biden, who both don't like him. Biden probably for being a moron. From Trump probably because, well, he's not right-wing enough for him, and he attacks him on all sorts of stuff that isn't right-wing enough for him. And then after that, he would get torn down for all of the crazy stuff he's done during his career in conspiracism and health nut nonsense, etc. And so I'd really not like it if you took that one, like you finally get a guy up there and then he's the dumbest person you could have possibly put in the room, or the person that is most frequently lies about the subjects that he's discussing. Like, it's already, Biden lies sometimes because he's a politician at the end of the day. Trump lies religiously. You put somebody like RFK up there, my God, man, you're going to need like a team of fact-checking surgeons just to keep track of what's going on during that debate. He would add to the toxicity of a Trump-Biden debate, which seems impossible, but he could make it possible. So I'm not against a third-party candidate under certain conditions being on that stage. We are not under those conditions, and he would be the worst option for the people who want third parties to succeed.
That they're trying to use to exclude me is that I need to have 4 polls, prescribed pollsters that have me at over 15%. We handed in 5 polls yesterday that have me from their companies that they've chosen. And there's a 6th poll that came out today that I'm actually looking at. It's the Marquette poll that has me at 17%. We think those are accurate polls. The Quinnipiac poll, the Marquette poll, the Monmouth poll, the Harvard-Harris poll, the New York Times Siena poll, and all have me over that threshold. What you're seeing is a lot of the polling companies have changed their methodologies. So instead of looking at a 3-way or 5-way race, they ask this question first. In a 2-way race between Trump and Biden, who would you choose? And it offers you Trump, Biden, and other. Well, then, if you press other, you're directed to another field where you're given a choice of me or Cornel West or Jill Stein. And that's a deceptive way of asking the poll, because that's not the way it will appear on the ballot. And
let me ask you the question this way.
Yeah.
Let me ask you the question this way, because obviously if you are looking to actually win this presidential election, you need the support. You need to win one of at least the big states. You need to win California, Texas, Florida. Do you think that you have a path to victory to win one of these states? Because right now, I mean, I'm looking at the polling. You're at roughly around 10% in Texas. Trump is at 46. Biden's at 36. California, Biden's at 48. Trump's at 28. You're at.
By the way, can I just be blunt? I do not think these numbers will hold. The more people learn, if RFK was joined in the presidential debates, I actually don't know if his numbers would go up or down, as people was like, oh, so he's Kennedy. I just thought it was, a hypothetical like JFK, or I thought it was somebody that's actually, part of the respected Kennedy lineage. Who's this guy? I really think that his name is just plowing him. I mean, his name is Kennedy. It is the political dynasty name.
11, Florida, Trump's at 47, Biden's at 38, you're at 7.5. So even if the methodology isn't to your liking, I mean, there's a massive disparity here between you and the other 2 candidates.
Well, again, you're reading from a methodology that is not correct. If you look at my polling
See, if you don't understand, the polls that are correct are the ones that have me higher, and the wrong ones are the ones that have me lower.
And you assume it's 17 or 18%. I'm 5.5 months out. All I have to do is get to 34% to win. So I'm thinking all I have to do is take.
Wait, even if we say that the number 17, like what he said, which is almost double what Brian was suggesting, but okay, let's give him that. He'd still need to double it again to get to the number he's talking about.
A few points away from both the other candidates. Now, in head-to-head races, I beat both candidates. I beat Trump in a head-to-head race, and this is from the biggest poll ever done.
You cannot poll Kennedy in a head-to-head race because nobody knows who Kennedy is. The general public doesn't know who Kennedy is. When they hear Kennedy, they think JFK. They don't think RFK. They don't think this guy.
This election, 26,000 people.
Well, I think Robert Kennedy. They think Robert Kennedy, not this Robert Kennedy, a different Robert Kennedy.
The polls that you're talking about have usually 600 to 2,200 people. This Ogby poll has 26,000. It's 10 times what the other polls have. It has a margin of error of practically 0. And it shows that in a head-to-head race, I beat President Trump by 3 electoral votes. It's a nail biter. In a head-to-head race against President Biden, I beat him. I win 39 states and he wins 11, so a landslide. So people want to vote for me. My favorability ratings are higher than either of them. I beat them among Americans under 35. I beat them in the battleground states among Americans under 45. And I'm not, the one cohort that I lose on is baby boomers.
To be clear, what RFK is saying
CNN
right now, that he would beat both Trump and Biden in a head-to-head election. I don't buy it. I don't believe it. But he's not even discussing that scenario, because that's not even the scenario. Shouldn't even be discussing that scenario, because that's not the scenario. The scenario is you're running against the two mainstays. You're running against the Democrat and Republican parties. And in his wildest dreams, he's at 17% right now. He'd need to more than double that in order to break the numbers he's talking about breaking. Nothing he's talking about gets anywhere close to that. And if he was really so much more popular than the other candidates, why isn't he polling more popular? If what he's saying is true, unless the reason he's not polling more popular is because, again, people just know him for his name, not for who he is. I'm sure there's some amongst that 10%, 11% that he's getting that know who he is. But I would honestly move that probably the majority of people who would answer that they'd vote for Kennedy don't know really next to anything about Kennedy.
MSNBC, ABC, NBC, CBS, the networks, which is where baby boomers get their news, have not let me on to debate. But I think what we're going to see is I'm starting to get on those, and we have a high conversion rate. I have 5.5 months, which is light years. I'm doing better than any.
Well, let me ask you about that then. You had brought up the idea of a no spoiler pledge that you had put forward to President Biden to sign. In the spirit of this pledge, will you drop out in the fall if you're still polling below Joe Biden?
What I said is that I will drop out if President Biden agrees to drop out. If in a head-to-head race, he is losing to President Trump, and I'm beating President Trump, he will have to drop out.
So what you're saying is, if you're looking at this polling and the polling remains, and you've got poll after poll after poll showing, as we head into the fall, Joe Biden at a higher rate than you in these polls, that in the spirit of that pledge, would you be willing to if you're saying that you want him to sign this, would you also be willing then, just in the spirit of this pledge, to drop out if you...
Well, this is the thing that gets me, is what RFK is talking about right now is that if you were to set, do polls that just RFK versus Trump versus Biden versus Trump, who polls better, that's who should run, others should drop out. He wants to make an agreement around that. Again, RFK's not tested really on the national stage. He isn't. When Ron DeSantis got on the national stage, he crumbled. Now, RFK has more political problems than DeSantis does, and no backing from either major party. So he would have to basically build the campaign around himself in his name, which Kennedy is a name, but he hasn't done anything in politics. He's not an elected official. He's not well known amongst the country. And so it is kind of strange to me if he's agreeing on principle that spoilers are bad because he would agree to an arrangement like this, but then still go on to be a possible spoiler candidate going into the main election, and he wouldn't agree against that. It shows to me that he knows spoilers are bad. He just doesn't want to make any agreement where he would judge himself as the spoiler, which is likely if he was to say, if I poll less than Biden, then I will have to drop out, because he'll never beat Biden in the polling data for president of the United States.
That in the spirit of that pledge, would you be willing to if you're saying that you want him to sign this, would you also be willing then, just in the spirit of this pledge, to drop out if you are at that point?
I would.
Or you'll only do it if he does it, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm willing to drop out if he signs the pledge too, and then.
But if he doesn't sign the pledge and you don't see a path to victory, then
I'm not going to drop out. Of course, I'm not going to drop out if he doesn't sign the pledge. I'm more likely. He cannot beat President Trump. I can beat President Trump. I'm not the spoiler. If you
fuck off. I mean, there are polls out right now having Biden beating Trump. Guess who beat Trump and is the only person who's beat Trump in an election? It is Joe Biden. The idea that he physically cannot or he cannot beat Donald Trump, is disprovable by the fact that he beat Donald Trump 4 years ago. We have no record of Robert Kennedy winning any election, and so him saying this is ridiculous to me, especially when he's not tested on the national stage. But he's a ridiculous person, so it's of no surprise.
The spoiler is somebody who cannot win and who is going to disrupt the...
And there's no scenario where RFK can win. There's no scenario where the system's going to turn on its head for an independent anti-vaxxer president for the United States. So it's not who isn't even liked by his own family. His own family has endorsed Joe Biden. No, come on.
Expectation of somebody who can. And
with all due respect, I mean, there's not a single national poll from any pollster. I know that you take issue with their methodology, but there's not a single poll from a national pollster that exists that shows you even within striking distance. I mean, in most of these polls, even ones that are that aren't friendly toward President Biden, I mean, there's still a 5-time disparity between you and him.
Yeah, well, you're wrong about that. The Zogby poll shows me beating President Trump, and he, under no conditions, can President Biden beat President Trump. So, you know, I'm not a spoiler.
Let me ask you a question on, because you brought up spoilers. The issue of playing spoiler has been front and center in this campaign. One of your top donors is Timothy Mellon, who was Trump's top donor in 2020. He's given $25 million to a super PAC supporting you, and he's given $25 million to a Trump-affiliated super PAC, which certainly does give the appearance that Trump's donors want you on the ballot to serve as a spoiler candidate on his behalf. So what's your relationship to Timothy Mellon, and why is he infusing your campaign with so much money?
You know, we get, I said this at the beginning of the campaign, Brian, that I want to run a campaign that appeals to both sides. I want to run a campaign that makes Republicans forget their Republicans and Democrats forget their Democrats. And everybody remember.
Why? Because they have a migraine trying to listen to him? I'm sorry, man, but it's really hard for me to take him seriously when he just I'd beat President Trump. I'd go out there and it's come on, build up, make it rely. I understand he has to make people believe in him, and that's the main hurdle that any independent candidate has to overcome. But he hasn't made a good argument about it.
Remember that they're Americans, so I'm getting money from Democrats, Republicans. I welcome money from people who support President Trump. I have people on our staff who came from the Trump campaign. I have people on our staff.
I understand all of that, but if he's giving money at the same time, $25 million is no small sum. If he's giving $25 million to Trump and to you, and this is a Trump-aligned donor, and he's your biggest donor to super PACs right now, do you have?
Wow, is he his biggest donor from super? Really? Yeah, I mean, come on, you couldn't say you don't know about him, and you couldn't know of his interests. I mean, why would he donate to Trump and you? It just seems like his one interest is making sure Biden doesn't win.
If he's giving $25 million to Trump and to you, and this is a Trump-aligned donor, and he's your biggest donor to super PACs right now, do you have any relationship with this person? Do you know why he's giving you this massive amount of money? Because clearly this isn't throwing his support behind you if he's also supporting Trump at the same time.
You would have to ask Timothy Mellon that with the super PAC. I'm not allowed to coordinate at all with the super PAC, but
Do you have a relationship with him?
With Tim Mellon, I've met Tim Mellon twice.
Okay, and that was enough to. There's no other inclination as to why he's donating.
Like I said, I welcome money from everybody. I don't think that. Listen, I'm more.
You can understand.
I do too, chat. I do too. DylanBurns.tv. DylanBurnsTV on Patreon.
How you can understand how.
Brian, I'm not sure what you're getting at, but President Trump. I'm running against President Trump. I have been a huge critic of President Trump's. I think he was a terrible president. I think he gave us the lockdowns. I think he shifted $4 trillion into this new oligarchy of super rich billionaires. I think he ran up the debt higher than any president in history. He presided over a chronic disease epidemic.
Well, the deficit isn't a think thing. That's a fact thing.
He promised to get us out of the wars, and he has, he brought John Bolton, who's the center of the war machine, to run the NSA. He was a terrible president. I'm running against him, so I'm not sure what point you're trying to get at. But
I think the point is obvious just from a layman's perspective. If you have a Trump donor who's also propping up the super PAC affiliated with you, that it would suggest that that person wants you on the ballot because he would perceive it as deriving benefit for Donald Trump.
Well, that's what you say. I don't think that is obvious. I think maybe that.
Okay,
here's what I believe from.
Well, let me ask this.
Here's what I believe from talking to Tim Mellon. I think Tim Mellon would prefer me to be president of the United States because he thinks that I would make a better president, and that if I'm not going to be president, that he would prefer President Trump to President Biden. Oh, I have a lot of donors who are in the same state, but would prefer, but Biden's their second choice.
I understand that. I understand
and
that.
by the way, the national polls, every single poll that has measured my favorability rating has shown that my favorability rating is much higher than President Trump.
It's hard to believe in his campaign when his biggest donors are telling him, like, come on, man. I mean, like, I would be cool if you could be president, but, like, I'm going to donate $25 million to Trump because, like, I got to be in reality over here. In our version of reality, having this Kennedy in the White House is somehow a crazier idea than the former host of The Apprentice, because this is 2024.
Trump's and President Biden's. So most Americans would rather vote for me. The reason they're voting for President Trump or President...
Most Americans would rather vote for me. Bold statement, sir. Bold declaration.
President Biden is out of fear.
If you say it confidently enough, people just, they believe it. They'll lean into it.
They feel by voting for me, they're throwing their vote away. But they'd rather vote for me. And I think Tim Mellon is in that category. He thinks that I'd be a better president of the United States, but he's hedging his bet by also betting on Donald Trump.
On this issue of spoiler candidates, your own running mate has admitted that your odds are slim. A senior advisor to your race has said, "I don't think the Kennedy campaign and the Trump campaign are enemies. It's us against the Democrats." These comments come after your campaign's former New York staffer. I'm sorry?
Who was that?
I'm going to play that audio right now.
And it looks like in this instance with RFK, he's going to probably take a lot of the votes away from Biden, correct? I mean, that's what you're looking at here.
By the way, can I just say quickly, we'll listen to this clip in a second. Do we know that Kennedy is going to take all these votes away from Biden? I mean, Kennedy is supposed to be like a Democrat, and he's got like the Kennedy Democrat legacy name. But if you actually check all the places that like he's received the best, it's conservative podcasts. It's like Tim Pool's show, probably. Like, these are the places that are not exactly swimming. I mean, Biden voters exist there, but it's not exactly swimming with Biden's core demographic. And so if he's picking up people from these events to actually go vote for him or donate for him or put their time into his campaign, I think it's not leaning Democrat. I don't think it's leading Biden. The only way it would lead Biden is purely by name recognition. Is purely by the name Kennedy, which puts us in the precarious situation where more people finding out about Kennedy might actually drop Kennedy's support. But then again, do you want to spend time raising the profile of an independent candidate?
Play that audio right now.
And it looks like in this instance with RFK, he's going to probably take a lot of the votes away from Biden, correct? I mean, that's what you're looking at here.
Well, yeah, that's true. I don't think that the Kennedy campaign and the Trump campaign are enemies, but we're all about America, and we know that it's us against the Democrats. Either way it goes.
I know what the media has done is it's taken people who have nothing to do with anything to do with the senior management of our campaign.
Well, and that inclusive of, there was the New York staffer who gave a presentation that the goal of the candidacy was to stop President Biden. But regardless, voters aside,
and that staffer was fired, and that staffer was not
But voters aside, why is it so hard to convince those closest to you and those working for you that you're not a spoiler in this race? I mean, these are people who were on your campaign regardless.
I mean, like, he can function as a spoiler without him thinking he is a spoiler. Like, you can be a spoiler without running to be a spoiler. Like, Chase Oliver is a dedicated libertarian. I would say somebody who's really principled about libertarian values within the Libertarian Party. And some people called him a spoiler. Some people call tons of different libertarians that have ran, or different, like, usually libertarian candidates have ran all across the countries. Spoilers. But if you go to talk to those libertarians and you ask them why they're running, they say, no, I'm not running because I'm a spoiler. I'm running because I want no more damn regulations on my toaster, whatever it is. I want my guns, whatever the issue might be. But they don't see themselves as a spoiler. They see somebody who's running on their values because they don't want to put their moral weight behind somebody who's not going to stand by the tree of liberty or whatever. So RFK doesn't himself need to be a spoiler for those who work with him to use him as a spoiler or to view him as a spoiler.
Regardless of whether they still are.
Well, those issues have nothing to do with spoiler. And the latter, you're putting out fires faster, or you're lighting fires faster than I can put them out, but they're fires that are brush fires. The first,
these are person,
the only person that you.
I don't want to even. I'm not. By the way, I'm not responding to any chat comments about his voice. Okay, because I'm trying not to go after people for things they can't control, and it's probably not good.
Fires that are brush fires. The first,
these are people.
The only person that you've just
personally, it's the things that he says that hurts the most when I listen to him.
Quoted is somebody who was a contract block coordinator who was gathering signatures for us in New York. And the mainstream media, of course, which is trying to discredit our campaign, interviews somebody, a low-level contract staffer, and gets an opinion from them and then attributes it to that campaign. Do you think that's fair? And that staffer, by the way, was let go because of that.
Every person I've talked to who liked RFK are conservative or libertarian. The man is a Trump spoiler.
I mean, he was at the Libertarian Convention, and Trump was bashing RFK also at the Libertarian Convention. But if Trump's trying to pick up libertarian votes, but those the thing is, the libertarian vote, when it comes to affecting the national elections every 4 years for president, if it's acting as a spoiler, and that's its main effect, and that's why Trump's going there, is to counteract it. If they end up going with RFK, going with him, then at the end of the day, he performs the same spoiler role. And if he keeps going to audiences like this and bringing people away from these crowds, again, RFK might end up backfiring. It's hard to say in advance because you're balancing the Kennedy name against RFK's actual podcast appearances and what's going to have a bigger impact. Plus, you don't know what states he's actually going to have ballot access in. If it's going to be all the major swing states or not, where these vote totals are going to matter the most, I don't know.
Staffer and gets an opinion from them and then attributes it to that campaign. Do you think that's fair? And that staffer, by the way, was let go because of that. So that's not journalism. That's just.
Well, I mean, I only work with the information that I have, and these are people who work.
Well, yeah, but you need to, part of being a journalist is actually verifying and checking information rather than just throwing stuff at the wall.
I mean, these are people who worked for the campaign. But let's move on. I want to talk about the issue of abortion.
We have 100,000 volunteers.
I understand. I do want to talk about abortion because
we don't screen them. We don't screen anybody for their opinions or their political affiliations. There's no organization.
I do want to talk about abortion.
That kind of political screening of people who volunteer for them.
So on the issue of abortion, which has presented itself as one of the top issues in the country right now, you stated a few months.
Do you think the brainworm in his head, because I saw people talking about the brainworm again in chat, do you think it died because it ate a tumor or died of starvation?
Months back that you would sign a national abortion ban. You then said that you opposed all restrictions. You now say that you support some restrictions. So help me understand your position. Would you sign a nationwide law restricting abortions after a certain point?
My position now is basically the same position as Roe v. Wade, which is that the woman, it's absolutely a woman's right to choose until late in the pregnancy, after the fetus becomes viable, that the state has a growing interest in protecting that life, and that my commitment is to reduce the number of abortions, not through force or through coercion, but through policies that will do that. About 52% of women interviewed who terminated pregnancy say that they do that for economic reasons because they can't afford the baby. And I don't believe that anybody should terminate a pregnancy for that reason. I think we need good child care policies in this country, the kind they have in every country in Europe and around the world, and that we need to bring a lot of that money home from Ukraine and invest in child care to make sure to actually benefit our economy and to grow our economy and to make sure that women who want to bring a baby to term are not terminating that pregnancy.
Look at that. Now everything's Ukraine's fault. Oh, abortion, that's also Ukraine's fault. Lack of resources for young mothers, also Ukraine's fault. Just give them all their resources. Imagine, like, you could do this with every war that's ever been participated, or any conflict, or any foreign initiative like we've ever done, good or bad. You could just say, we could be spending this foreign money at home, but instead we're spending it at the foreign place. Like, it doesn't talk about any of the, you know, like, it could be that both of these issues matter. And this is the problem I have when people pit two completely distinct issues against each other. Putting aside any of the specifics I could get into about, you can't just send a bunch of new mothers like fucking Bradley fighting vehicles and cluster bombs and expect them to be able to figure it out and turning that into monetary value for their child. I guess they could use the cluster bomb to defend their home. They'd probably need a jerry-rig a delivery system. But putting that aside, putting aside all of the practical implications, all of the reasons that, you know, you can't just convert this all into cold hard cash, and much of this aid has been valued like 30, 40, 50 years ago. Putting all that aside, I don't like the pitting of two issues like this against each other, because it could be, for example, that both the installation of speed bumps in a city and the installation of stop signs in a city are both important. Or if we want to make it two distinct issues, the installation of stop signs and the improvements to a school. Both of these can be important issues, but when you start making like, oh, I mean, we need to improve our education instead of wasting all our money on another just metal sign, like, these are two issues that could both be important, and no need to like knock the other one down in order to build it up. You need to measure each task on its own merits and what resources we have to deal with the task. We had a bunch of old Cold War equipment that we were never going to use that we could give to the Ukrainians to help them. We had cluster bombs in our reserves that we could give them to help. We had all this different stuff that we could give them to help them. That was the means we had, and we could do that while also dealing with the child care issue. There's no thing that make these two things distinct, that you either help Ukraine or you do child care. I mean, the New Deal and World War II overlapped, okay?
So on that point then, you know,
financial insecurities.
In a recent podcast, I believe it was a week ago, with Matt and Shane, you said that you support these restrictions because you learned of women having, and this is a quote, a huge amount of abortions up until, you know, what it would be at the late term, so days before birth. And this is a point that a lot of anti-choice Republicans make, but none of them have been able to substantiate it. So my question is, what's the proof here? Like, do you think that women who are in good health with healthy pregnancies are just walking into doctors' offices asking for abortions 2 days before birth?
Yeah, my assumption was that that was not true. And that's why I changed my position. My original position was that it should be a woman's choice right up until the 9th month. And my assumption was that that no woman is going to carry a baby for 9 months and then get an abortion unless there are extenuating circumstances.
And you don't believe that. You don't believe that.
You want me to finish?
Yes.
All right. Unless there are extenuating circumstances, for example, that the baby had a disease that would ensure that the baby would only live a couple of hours or maybe a couple of weeks in agonizing pain, or if the mother's life was at risk. And in those cases, the last thing that you would want is a bureaucrat or state government to come in and mess with that decision. What I learned was that there are a tremendous number of elective abortions at the last stage. And I can't tell you why that happens, but all I can tell you is the data that we're looking at that was shown to me indicates that that is true. And therefore, I changed my position, which I always say to people, I'll never change position because people are angry at me or because people defame me. The one thing that will cause me to change my position is facts that show that my worldview does not account for, and my policies do not account for for reality.
Well, on that point, I mean, do you know what % of women are getting abortions after 21 weeks? And this isn't a gotcha.
I don't know the exact percentage.
So the exact percentage is 0.9% of these of women who are getting abortions after 21 weeks. So a minuscule number of a percentage of women. This 99.1% of women who are not. The most recent study from 2022.
And what percentage of those are elective abortions?
So the most recent study from 2022 of patients seeking these later term abortions found that they fell into two buckets. It was either fetal anomalies or health risks to the mother, or women who didn't know they were pregnant. And then the other bucket is women who experience barriers to abortion services earlier in the pregnancy. So the question then becomes, when you say that there are a huge amount of abortions that would necessitate some federal intervention, where is the proof of that?
Well, I would have to look at the data again, and which I'm happy to do. But the data that we were shown was that there were a large number of abortions that were elective in the end, at the end of pregnancy. So, if there are any abortions at that,
there are very few to next to nil elective, if you can find. Honestly, I'd have to go check. Surgery, for how many? We're done in the United States. Elective surgeries that late in the pregnancy. Almost all of them are going to be for health reasons that late in the pregnancy. It's going to be for people who ran into unexpected health problems, who wanted to have children, but then at the last stage were given horrible news. I mean, how prevalent is that? I mean, there's regulations in most areas against it's the day before my birth, give me the bat. I don't think that's legal.
At that point, it's wrong. It's a viable child at 9 months, and let's say 9 months and 1 day. Should you be able to abort? I mean, do you think you should be able to abort a perfectly healthy child at 9 months?
But there's no evidence that women are doing that. That's the whole basis for what I'm asking. When you impose federal interventions against women who the data show are dealing with fetal anomalies, health risks to the mother, then I shouldn't be litigating that. No government bureaucrat should be litigating that. That's a decision between a woman and her doctor, because these issues are highly personal.
Yeah, and so here's what should make you happy is that the only abortions that I would limit at that time would be elective abortions. I would not abort if there is a medical reason for the abortion. I don't think it should be. I think that should be between the mother and the doctor. The
thing that scares me, and if somebody's making the elective choice a day before their birth, I don't want it. At that point, you would have to, you have to give birth. I'm sorry, that's how it works. Because at that point, they've developed into a full person. If we're gonna the idea that it's a few hours before birth, we can kill it. It's fine. Oh, it's a few hours after. Never mind. It's there's not a magic transformation. There's a bodily autonomy transformation that goes on in that, but there's not a magic transformation that goes on in that period. But if this is not a big issue or any issue, what would happen in the introduction of new federal restrictions on abortion? What worries me, and this is the thing that worries me the most, is that this regulation, if placed in good faith, so assuming that it wasn't used as a backdoor to try to regulate abortions that do not fall under that at the late term, what would scare me is the idea of doctors second guessing whether or not to give a woman those types of services at the during a medical crisis or something like that, because they're worrying about either legal repercussion or, let's hold back on announcing it, because there have been situations where the mother's risk was maybe on the line. They didn't know for sure. And so they didn't know if whether or not the surgeon could really give approval for an abortion to go through at this late stage. And it can put the mother's life at risk. Those hours and that time that they hesitate and they wait to see how it develops, it can you can have a risk on the mother's life. And that's something that concerns me, is that it'll tie up the hands of doctors who will fear legal repercussion for giving a woman what he believes to be the wisest medical decision at an extremely difficult point at the end of pregnancy.
Abortions that I would limit at that time, or allow the states to limit, would be elective abortions. So if there's a lot, then, you know, those would be regulated by the state. If there are only one or two, then those are the ones that would be regulated.
I want to switch gears to in a deposition that was obtained by the New York Times, you had claimed that you suffered cognitive damage because of mercury poisoning, and you've spoken about this pretty frequently, and a brain worm, a parasite that ate parts of of your brain. You said that these cognitive problems decreased your earning power and they compromised your ability to pay spousal support. So if you yourself said that these cognitive problems were severe enough to be brought up as a legal basis for not paying spousal support, how do you respond to concerns that these problems would make you unfit to serve as president, which is obviously a physically and cognitively taxing job?
Yeah, a couple of things I don't think you're accurate about. One,
better question: did the brain worm endorse RFK?
is it's a 13-year-old deposition. Two is I knew that I was experiencing cognitive problems back then. I don't think it was because of that parasite. There's 1 billion people in the world that have that parasite, and many of them don't have any symptoms. I believe today that my cognitive issues were attributable to the mercury. I had 10 times the rate of mercury that EPA considers safe, and I had that mercury chelated out. And my cognitive problems disappeared. And I take cognitive tests every day, and it's, on TV shows like this, on podcasts. I think the ultimate cognitive test will be a presidential debate, and I would welcome that. And I would welcome, the other candidates to also participate in that cognitive exam with me.
Well, President Biden obviously released his medical records when Donald Trump was president. He released his as well. Would you release your medical records to give the American public a full look at any cognitive problems?
Yeah, sure, I will. I'm happy to give my medical records to the same extent that the other candidates did. But, what I think that you should really be concerned about, Brian, is whether the presidents are actually cognitively.
I don't know. If I was him, I'd want to give as much medical information as possible, as long as there's nothing that's going to really undermine people's confidence in voting for him, which maybe that exists. I don't know. I'm not his doctor. But if his whole point is, I'm the third candidate, the two big parties suck, vote for me, he needs to offer something that the other two candidates aren't. So when the other two candidates hide their medical problems, I would pitch transparency, the transparency candidate. It doesn't need to be a shtick necessarily, but you got to offer something that the other two major parties aren't if you want people to throw their vote away on you.
Capable, if they have the mental acuity, that presidential candidates, to take on this job. Remember, this is a job that if there's a nuclear emergency and the president is woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning, he has 7 minutes to make the decision about whether to retaliate. At that time, he's pulled out of bed. He's being run through tunnels with 6 Secret Service people pushing him. Do you want President Biden? Do you trust him to make a decision that is going to affect the lives of every American and your children?
Much more than RFK. I mean, from my experience in the war in Ukraine, from being here on the ground, seeing the stuff that's going on here on the ground, and then reading reports of how the Biden administration has approached Russia, he is much more reserved than I would have been, considering the Russian escalation question. Not that we should race into escalation, but that that they took slow steps at every stage to try to not give any big point where the Russians could use as a justification to escalate. So not send all the aid at once, but slowly send more and more and more. So there's no big point where he can, put all his chips on, so to speak. He has been somebody who was dragging his feet on sending the ATACMs, dragging his feet on Western tanks. The idea of, we can't send Western tanks because of the escalator. It's Western tanks. We sent 31 Abrams. How bad is that really? Biden has been quite reserved. I mean, right now we've got like the Swedish foreign minister, we got Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian politicians, all types of European MPs, the Helsinki Commission, members of Biden's own party, Anthony Blinken, other members of the State Department, former members of the State Department, Victoria Nuland, all sorts of people in the general like foreign policy sphere and in his party and around Biden who are pushing him to give the Ukrainians permission to use ATACMS on Russian soil. And they still haven't done it yet. Even after the Kharkiv offensive, which showed that according to the Ukrainians, that the Russians were building up on the other side of the border. They knew where they were. They could take them out, and they didn't. They didn't use the Western weapons, the ATACMS, to take them out because of the restrictions placed upon them. The fact that Biden at this stage, with how much is on the line for Europe, how much is on the line for Ukraine, how much is on the line for American credibility, is still taking into consideration that level of escalation, makes me think that he takes the nuclear question seriously. That doesn't mean I necessarily agree with every single way he interprets that question. Maybe sometimes I would say that they're cautious to the point of dragging their feet, but I certainly think that he gives the issue the seriousness it deserves. Trump, I mean, I don't know if the tornado nuke story is real. The rocket man threatening nuclear war with North Korea was certainly real. I don't know if he was really asking, as has been reported, asking his generals why the United States can't use its nuclear weapons, if he didn't understand that concept. But as for RFK, he is somebody who, to me, has showed no qualities to even hold a public service job of any respect, let alone president of the United States, whether it be his general kookery, whether, his just like cuckoo, like that type of behavior, whether it was his constant lying, whether it's his terrible foreign policy beliefs, which I think will encourage escalation by breaking down deterrence to leaving the Russians a giant power vacuum in the middle of Europe, which I have every belief that they will try to take advantage of. I don't think he's the right person for the job. Not on this element either.
That test should happen, not because of medical records where doctors can obscure problems with their powerful patients, rather by allowing every American to observe the mental acuity of these candidates on a stage, in a public forum, under hot questioning, annealed in the furnace of debate and conversation. And that, I think, is what, if you're genuinely concerned about this issue, rather than just agenda-driven, I think that's probably what we should be looking for.
I want to finish off with this, and then we'll end it here. So your views on vaccines have obviously been controversial. I'm not, going to delve into the anti-vax sentiment or whatnot. But I do want to talk about one instance in Samoa. In 2018, there were 2 children who died from a measles vaccine. That was after a nurse incorrectly mixed the vaccine with a muscle relaxant. So it was human error. The prime minister then banned MMR vaccines after that. Your organization, Children's Health Defense, praised him. You then visited in 2019 in a trip that was arranged by an anti-vax influencer named Edwin Tomasese. You met with another anti-vax influencer named Taylor Winterstein. So anti-vax sentiment spread across the island, and later that year, Samoa was hit with a measles outbreak that was the express result of a decline in vaccination rates. I believe only 31% of Samoans were vaccinated at that time. In the year leading up to 2019, there were 0 cases of measles in those years. In 2019 proper, though, there were over 5,000 cases and 83 deaths.
I remember reading about the story. Everything that Brian is saying right now seems to be accurate for me. It's been a while since I read the story, since RFK announced a while ago. But this story really did baffle me, that anyone would make a soiree in the politics again after, this is their big issue, it's public health. Then they make one big showing on the public health scene in Samoa, and this is the result of it. And then we're supposed to take him as a public health expert.
So do you recognize how perpetuating vaccine skepticism or especially propping up anti-vax influencers can lead to such devastating health consequences?
No, the best evidence, first of all, I had nothing to do with the drop-off in vaccination rates in Samoa.
Well, the AP did an interview. Sure. Let me just say the AP did interview folks who were working on the Samoan measles response, and they said that the credibility that you gave to the anti-vax population, the anti-vax forces, did have an impact.
Well,
those were people who were in Samoa.
His name is Kennedy. Again, his most powerful tool will always and forever be, and this is true for most of the Kennedy household, his name.
But there's plenty of data on the drop-off. The vaccine was banned before I went to the country. So the drop-off that you saw did not change between the time I left the country and the time the measles epidemic. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the deaths that occurred, the best evidence shows that the deaths that occurred from measles that year were a result of a defective vaccination. So the people who died were people who got the vaccine while they had measles, which you should never do. In Tonga, which is next door, which also had a measles outbreak and where they were not given the vaccine, there were no deaths. Oh, of course, the vaccine cartel and the public health cartel that likes to propagandize on this issue points to this and say, oh, the deaths occurred because lowered vaccination rate. But there is no data that shows that. There's no paper that shows that. There's no science that shows that. There's just propaganda. And the best science indicates that the actual reasons for those deaths in Samoa were a defective vaccine that was brought in from Australia and was pulled when the public health authorities realized that it was killing people.
But that's not what the evidence says. The evidence says that...
Okay, I'm going to read this. Now, this is from the National Library of Medicine, the National Center for Biotechnology Information. This is the National Institute of Health. So, I don't know, put .gov, by the way, scary.gov. In 2019, a significant measles outbreak emerged in American Samoa. The Samoan Ministry of Health was the first of the Pacific Island nation to declare an outbreak of measles on October 16th, 2019, amidst of the global measles resurgence. As of January 22nd, 2020, there have been reported 5,707 measles cases and 83 measles-related fatalities, an approximately attack rate of 285 cases per 10,000 people. The majority of deaths, approximately 25 deaths per 10,000 individuals, were attributed. The majority of deaths were attributed. Wait 1 second. This is kind of confusing how it's written. The majority of the deaths were attributed in children of under 5 years. There we go. It was just written weirdly. A decline in child MMR immunization coverage below the WHO recommended 95%, because like you said, it was at 31, needed to maintain herd immunity. Global measles virus spread, increasing travel among affected countries, and vaccine hesitancy caused this measles epidemic. After 2 vaccine-related pediatric deaths, the immediate suspension of MMR vaccines and national immunization program related to the community mistrust in vaccination safety and contributed to vaccine hesitancy.
It was actually, the evidence says that it was actually 2 vaccines that were mixed with an expired muscle relaxant.
You know what? No, again, that is propaganda. That is propaganda. And there was a series of deaths that occurred from vaccines, from the MMR vaccine prior to that, and a series of injuries, including in the Prime Minister's own family. And that's why he made the decision long before I went to Samoa to ban the MMR vaccine in Samoa.
Donald Trump has come out and said that he wouldn't fund schools that mandated certain vaccines. Do you agree with that decision?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Damn.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Wait, back up. Like any vaccines, like if a school mandates a measles vaccine in order to keep the 95% herd immunity, I'm sure there would be individual exemptions, as there has been for people who have actual conditions to make it so they can't get that vaccine. Once you've gotten checked from a doctor and you've submitted said information showing that you actually can't take the vaccine due to health concerns. But that without that 95% herd immunity, that's how you get resurgent measles and polio outbreaks.
He wouldn't fund schools that mandated certain vaccines. Do you agree with that decision?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time. I understand that it's easy to stay in certain ecosystems when speaking to media figures. So I do appreciate you venturing out and kind of being willing to speak to me here.
I appreciate you having me on, Brian. I want to speak to everybody, including people who don't agree with me on issues. I want to say this. My vaccination policy will not take away vaccines from anybody who wants access to them. My only issue is they should not be mandated. I don't think any medical intervention should be mandated. And let me just say this, that right now, the CDC is recommending the 9th COVID booster. Oh, that's their recommendation. 90% of Americans have made a decision not to take it. Do you think that the federal government should do what they did with the first booster, which is to tell people, okay, you can't work, you can't travel, you can't get on an airplane, you can't go to your job unless you do what CDC says? So I don't think that most Americans want that.
Wait. I feel like we're transitioning. We were talking, this is a different question than the question we were just talking about. We were talking about children, very young kids who, when you talk about polios, measles, and things, like the measles outbreak, we're talking about kids under the age of 5 were the majority of the people that were dying, right? So we're talking about the young, the most vulnerable to these diseases, before the body can build up all those defenses to beat back, all of the diseases when they're young. That's when we're trying to get them vaccinated while they're going to schools in environments with a bunch of other dirty, disgusting children who are going to be licking walls and windows and like throwing food at each other and being filthy, disgusting children because they're children. That is very different than if you do not get this specific vaccine, you cannot work anywhere and be anywhere. But the idea of having to get vaccines for common diseases that we have eradicated to keep them eradicated instead of it resurging back into the public sphere, killing kids again. Yeah, I'm fine with mandating that. We've mandated that forever, and it wasn't politicized until recently. And are we really going to be like, fine, we'll let thousands and thousands and thousands of more kids die every year just so we can make a statement on this, even though it wasn't an issue before? I mean, think about how many bro dude, strong types who would I would never get vaccinated. Oh my God. How many of them were making a ruckus about vaccine mandates for the military since forever? Should we get rid of the vaccine mandate for the armed forces? If you join the armed forces, you don't need to get vaccinated. I assume we wouldn't extend it to that. That'd be too ridiculous. But the schools, we're moving to a separate topic. The idea of making it so every single COVID booster shot by every American has to get it is very different than you have to get a measles and polio vaccine in order to go to school or get an exemption from a doctor because you have a vaccine, you can't get vaccines for whatever medical issue you have. Very different.
What I want is good testing, good safety testing for vaccines, good efficacy testing, so that everybody can make informed consent about whether they want this product or not, whether it's good for their age group, whether it's good for their cohort, whether it's good for them. And let's do the same kind of safety testing we require for other drugs. And we don't do that for vaccines. Vaccines are exempt. The only medical product that's exempt from pre-licensing safety studies, and of the 72 vaccines now mandated for our children, not one of them has ever been tested in a pre-licensing safety study. That's just wrong. We know people get injured, and that's who I'm concerned with. If you're fine with it, if you've gotten a good result, you should be able to get it. We ought to be not telling people when they're injured that it didn't happen and gaslighting them and punishing doctors who report injuries. We should be doing good science, and we should be supporting people who actually get injured by these products.
I think I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but the numbers are pretty clear in terms of the efficacy and the safety of this COVID vaccine, and it was used on the biggest.
1 second. Vaccine safety testing. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, must license, quote unquote, approve a vaccine before it can be used in the United States. FDA regulations for the development of vaccines help to ensure their safety. Before a vaccine is approved by the FDA for use by the public, results of studies on safety and effectiveness of the vaccine are evaluated by highly trained FDA scientists and doctors. The FDA also inspects the vaccine manufacturing sites to make sure they comply with current good manufacturing practice and regulations. Now, I'm going to be clear. I don't know what a pre-licensing safety study is, but there are studies done by professionals to test the safety of these vaccines. That did happen. That's not made up. Being clear about that. I'd have to go specifically and look up the pre-license safety study stuff, but I just wanted to double check because there was studies on the effectiveness and safety on this before it was released.
On the largest scale of any vaccine in America in the history of the world, and again, those numbers are pretty clear in terms of the efficacy of this vaccine, in terms of the number of hospitalizations and deaths for people who didn't get the vaccine versus those who did get the vaccine.
Okay, Brian, you know what? You're talking about data that does not exist. And I'll just tell you a couple of things. Our country had the worst body count from COVID of any country in the world and one of the most aggressive vaccination schedules. We had 60%.
I would also say that we had the Republican president who was not exactly advocating for vaccinations or even taking the virus itself seriously. I mean, Donald Trump was downplaying the severity of the virus. But it became politicized.
Now you're talking crazy talk. But let me just finish this.
It became completely politicized, and there was
it did become politicized. But Trump's in this weird area where, like, at the start, he was like, it's not really an issue. It's not going to come to America. Or, well, you know, and he didn't start throwing out like random like health theories. Like, well, maybe if it gets hot enough, it'll just go away. Or, well, you know, this bleach that, like, he just started throwing out like this armchair med MDing America's public health crisis before eventually sliding into Operation Warp Speed in order to speed up vaccine development, which was good. I don't necessarily think it was Trump leading the initiative. But his administration did do it under his presidency, so that was good. But Trump was not exactly a public health advocate on behalf of vaccines. He just wanted a quick, I don't know, I felt like part of it might have been results oriented. Like, well, people were like, if I have a solution now, what solution? Vaccine, get vaccine out. But that doesn't mean he was taking public health particularly seriously. But that also doesn't mean it wasn't good that we tried to speed up vaccine production in some capacity.
President Trump brags about the vaccine as the miracle of his administration, the Operation Warp Speed, the greatest accomplishment of his administration.
Doesn't talk about that much anymore. I don't know if he's just seen like the politicization has changed how people talk about vaccines and he's just shut up accordingly, or what. Maybe he does talk about it and I just didn't see it. You know, something to always remember, a good rule of thumb is just because you didn't see it doesn't mean it didn't happen.
So he wasn't hostile to the vaccine. He was doing whatever Anthony Fauci.
There was a clear partisan divide in terms of people who take the vaccine.
There is a partisan divide between the people who got vaccinated and people who didn't. And Republicans were much more likely to not be vaccinated. And that led to a real lethality difference between Democrats and Republicans when it came to those who caught COVID. Because not only does it make it less likely for you to catch COVID and therefore spread COVID, it also makes it less likely for you to die or have severe symptoms if you were to get COVID.
There you go. Go ahead.
Let's just talk about data. We had 16% of the COVID deaths in our country. We only had 4.2% of the world's population. So why isn't somebody explaining to us why we had the highest death rate in the world? We were told that Haiti and Nigeria were going to get wiped out from COVID. Haiti had a 1%, 1.3% vaccination rate. It had a death rate from COVID, 1/200th of our death rate. Nigeria had a 1.4% vaccination rate.
Honestly, I don't know how, I'm not a Haiti expert. How good is the Haitian healthcare system to, definitely under current conditions, to be testing people and like, oh, this death was COVID related or it was respiratory related. Like how many COVID deaths are getting marked as COVID deaths and how many non-COVID deaths are getting marked? I mean, people talk about non-COVID deaths being marked as COVID deaths all the time, but what about the COVID deaths that never get marked because somebody dies and that's it. And that's how it is. Like, do you pay for an autopsy on everybody in Haiti? Like, I don't know. I don't know about Haiti. So it's impossible for me to say. Maybe he knows more about it than I do.
It had a death rate from COVID of 14 per million population. We had a death rate of 3,000 per million population. Oh, there's no correlation between vaccination and death counts. In fact, the best studies like the Cleveland Clinic study, which is 56,000.
By the way, that's just not true. It's absolutely that's just like a straight up like top to bottom lie.
Patients, one of the biggest studies, shows that people who got vaccinated were more likely to get COVID. There is no study that shows
Of course. The scientists installed the COVID magnets.
Shows that COVID had a beneficial impact on deaths. I know that you're told that. This is orthodoxy, but the studies just simply don't exist. And the clinical trial study is never measured for that. In fact, Pfizer's clinical study, which is the one that is made public, showed that people in the placebo group were 23% less likely to die than people in the vaccine group. So the vaccine, if you got vaccinated, you're 23% more likely to die of all causes over the next 6 months, with a 500% increase in cardiac arrest. We're now seeing a whole generation of kids.
I don't know if he's talking about myocarditis or cardiac arrest itself, but there is an increased risk of myocarditis that came with, I don't know if it was all, but it was certainly some of the vaccines. I forget if it was Pfizer or Moderna. But that increased risk of myocarditis that people complain about as much of the reason that motivated a lot of people not to get the vaccine, or at least the people who were very against it. The risk of you getting myocarditis is higher if you catch COVID, have a severe case of COVID.
We're dying from cardiac arrest on the playing fields. We're seeing athletes drop dead on the playing fields at rates we've never seen in history. And nobody...
Okay, now this is just like rabid, dumb speculation. Like, I saw an athlete fall over. Must have been the COVID. Like, it's just, like, come on, man. Yo, I was... Oh, man, I was out near the front, I gotta say, and we were getting bombed by the Russian army, and we had to get down, and it just went over and over and over, and it pounded our position as they pinned us to the ground. We didn't know if they were hitting us or the neighbors, and God, in that moment, I thought, my goodness, I hope I don't get hit by a shell and get killed by the vaccine. Like, really, like, we can't just... Like, at this point, we're just speculating about what is vaccine-related injuries, what aren't vaccine-related injuries. He's trying to, like, cite the studies and stuff, which, look, we can go into specific studies if we really want to. I don't want to, so I'm not going to. But then he gets to all these cases of these people just falling down, and he doesn't need a study for that. He fall down, that's enough evidence for me. Too suspicious that an athlete would fall down, must be the vaccine. Could have been any number of medical issues. Could be just confirmation bias, and you're just noticing it now more. And now anytime someone stubs their toe, you say, vaccine death. But come on.
He is explaining that in the press. The liberal media is not asking the questions, was that person vaccinated and does this? We're seeing 2 of the 4 vaccines have now been pulled because of pericarditis, myocarditis, thrombocytopenia, which is blood clots. We're seeing larger excess deaths last year after vaccination with no COVID than during the height of COVID. So nobody can explain this, but what you were saying about the decline in deaths simply because of the vaccination, that data simply do not exist.
Well, I would disagree with that, but I'm also not a doctor.
Show me the data. Show me the data. Show me the study that you're relying on.
I do have to ask, is it your position then that the politicization of the virus, of the vaccine, had zero impact on survival rates in the aftermath of COVID?
There was the data that is clear. The data on that is clear.
There was a clear delineation between Fox News watchers, for example, who had higher death rates than those who were not watching Fox News, who were not consuming right-wing media, who had higher survival rates.
Well, I wouldn't say that the highest death rates in this country was in New York, which is a blue state.
Right, but that was in the beginning before there was a vaccine. At the end of the pandemic, it was actually in Florida, led by Ron DeSantis, who is, of course, a major opponent of any vaccines.
Well, Florida would have,
Is Ron DeSantis an opponent of any vaccines? Is that true? He's not against the polio measles vaccine. That can't be politically viable. Can it?
It was actually in Florida, led by Ron DeSantis, who is, of course, a major opponent of any vaccines.
Well, Florida would have. You would expect Florida to have the highest death rate. I'm not sure that it did. I know that Florida outperformed California, and they're roughly equivalent in size, but Florida has a much older population, and those were people who would die from COVID. So I think what you're saying about red state or blue state, that there is no study that, there are lots of other, there's more obesity in red states. There's more elderly people in Florida. So there are a lot of covariables.
You don't think politics played any role in the acceptance or refusal?
I will say that if you're talking about there is a certain extent where there might be a point here. For example, if you're a Fox News viewer, the odds of you being an elderly person versus if you were, say, a NPR reader or somebody who was getting their information from somewhere else, probably higher. But can we really say that age alone made up for such a big difference?
Of vaccines in the aftermath of COVID.
I do, but I don't think vaccines had a benefit. I don't think there's any data that show that the vaccines had a beneficial impact on the reduction of COVID or survivability of the COVID. I'd love to see the study if you can show it to me.
I'll be happy to put it on the screen. I obviously can't grab it.
All the data that I am looking at, for example, take a look at the Cleveland Clinic study. Take a look at the studies that are coming out of Europe right now. One after the other, they're showing that there was no beneficial impact to the vaccines. There may have been.
No, there's differences in like how much it restricts the spread or how much it increases survivability. There's like arguments about precisely how much or how like little it might have, but there's no credible studies coming out saying the vaccine had literally no impact on survivability of the individual. There's no studies, no credible studies coming out saying that. This kind of sucks though. This conversation is the equivalent of my studies say I'm right. No, my studies say I'm right. That's what we're at right now.
I mean, one of the problems during COVID is that we had information chaos. We didn't, Dr. Fauci and his cohorts were not giving us good information on basic things like infection fatality rates and the use of therapeutic drugs and comparisons between ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, famotidine, and all these other drugs that demonstrated efficacy against COVID, and comparing those against vaccines. We never saw those kind of data, and that's what we should have seen. That's what good managers would have done.
So I have something here from the CDC. Vaccinated Americans are up to 14 times less likely to die from COVID. That was from the CDC.
Yeah, and show me.
23.
Right. And
the
those
health
studies
mafia?
that CDC cranks out are modeling studies. They're not data studies. They're not observational studies. They're not epidemiological studies. They're studies that show that start out with the premise, we think this is how many people are saved by the vaccine, and then they model that. But there's no actual real world data. And they use that to hoodwink you, Brian. That's how they hoodwink the American press. They use these phony studies done by biostitutes, which are these mercenary scientists.
Mercenary science.
They say
We'll see. There is a ton of data out there that shows from people who owe their lives to the fact that they were able to get vaccines. You have people who weren't.
How can you do that study? Explain to me how you do that.
Dude, he's got such a smile. This is his wheelhouse. This is RFK's like wheelhouse. Is these vaccine conversations. So he's having fun here. I don't know if he really thinks that he's like pulling back the wool over people's eyes, or like how genuine he is in this belief of this. But that America Samoa stuff really should have shaked his confidence in this type of behavior. And he's still in it. You can never claim that he didn't have an opportunity to know better, even if he doesn't. Bop and Wap, thank you so much for the gifted tier 1 sub to T Kangas. And if anybody else wants to donate to today's stream, we do freelance war journalism here on the ground in Ukraine, and that is expensive. It's expensive to hire editors, it's expensive to hire translators, it's expensive to hire fixers, and any donations to DylanBurns.tv, the website, or DylanBurns TV on Patreon is, of course, greatly appreciated as we're getting towards the end of stream here.
They were able to get vaccines. You have people who weren't.
How can you do that study? Explain to me how you do that study. How do you do a study when somebody says, "Oh, I got the vaccine, therefore I'm alive today"? That's not science. There's plenty of people like me who didn't get it and are alive.
Well, you would test the severity of symptoms of people who got the vaccine and didn't get the vaccine to see if, like, on average, who has more intense systems, test survivability. You know, I guess there would be a few ways.
Today, should I say that I didn't get it because I'm alive today because I didn't get it?
I think you can look at the number of people who did die during COVID who weren't vaccinated, and that would tell the story pretty clearly.
Yeah, well, and guess what? The vaccinated cohorts were more likely to die than the unvaccinated cohorts.
This is such bizarre fucking nonsense. It's just bizarre. That's not something that's been repeated. There's no studies repeating, credible studies repeating and showing this is something that can be demonstrated. If it can be demonstrated that the vaccine makes you more likely to die from COVID on a repeated basis under controlled environments, it would be the story of the century that Moderna just made you like super vulnerable to COVID. They just gave you like a debuff against COVID when they were supposed to give you a vaccine. It'd be the story of the century. And it's like hid between like a subletter of some study, not to be repeated ever, but it stands as the ultimate truth that he's now holding above his head. Bullshit.
And you don't have good data because, you know, the vaccinated cohorts were so small. You know,
well, I think it's a little bit it's a little too convenient to say that any data that doesn't support your conclusion is not good data.
Oh, but I agree with that. So let's look at. I'm happy to sit down with you on another show, go study by study, and I will show you the problems with those studies, and you can show me the.
Brian should take him up on this offer 100%, and then bring in somebody who's a medical expert who knows what they're talking about. Maybe a medical statistician.
Problems with the studies, which are overwhelming on the other side. But what I would say to you is because the public health agencies were not funding good studies during COVID, they were funding deceptive studies, that we don't have really good data where you can say definitively one way or another about each cohort. But, you know.
Wait, how could you say you can't say definitively? And you just said that you're more likely to die if you got it.
Even CDC today is saying it's a mistake to give these vaccines to kids. The death rate to kids from COVID was zero. Why would you give them an intervention of something that does have a risk, that can kill you, if they have no risk from the disease?
Again, but the things like myocarditis that are being cited, you have a higher likelihood of getting myocarditis, I'm losing the English language in real time. It is like 5 a.m., 6 a.m. here in Ukraine. Okay, you gotta give me some slack. But these rates were higher amongst those who got COVID. You were more likely to suffer from that if you got COVID.
Disease itself. So, you know, I think there were a lot of mistakes made.
We'll leave it there. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
It was supposed to end 10 minutes earlier. They extended another 10 minutes. Brian got him. 40 minutes, 40-minute RFK interview. This was a decent interview. I mean, my main problems with this interview is just going to be stuff that Brian Tyler Cohen wouldn't have had the data on ready, or they wouldn't have had the voice in the room. Like, if I'm going to sit down, if I'm going to conversation with somebody at length about vaccines, I think there should be like an expert on vaccines in the room. Like, if you're going to be talking about the war in Ukraine, it'd be good if you could have the person in the room. That doesn't happen in a lot of scenarios, though. And so you kind of have to do the best that you can. And I think showing the studies on screen is good. I think that, honestly, if I could, I want to integrate that more into debates and conversations I have, so I could put up the data, studies, and examples on screen. I mean, we can't try to do it live, but obviously if you're having a live debate, Googling and debating back and forth, you know, you can get a little lost in yourself. But I thought Brian Tyler Cohen did pretty well here. Again, most of my critiques would be restricted in the area of just like not enough pushback, because he didn't have the voices on the screen, on the stream, that would have, you know, the skills and knowledge to give sufficient pushback. Nevertheless, though, I think it did pretty well. Seeing him answer on a big stage for what happened in American Samoa was good. And I do wish he gave a little pressure on the Ukraine stuff, but that's a personal gripe. And it was kind of a drive-by shooting on the Ukraine topic by RFK. So I understand. And I'm kind of willing to give Brian Tyler Cohen a little slack on that. A way to support the channel is by going to DylanBurns.tv, donating, subscribing, and supporting the channel with whatever amount you can give up. I don't want any of you guys to bankrupt yourselves, but we want to make sure that this show can make ends meet so we can continue to document the war on the ground here while the war is going on. You can only document events as they happen. After the fact, it's too late. So let's get on it when we can.